Hey, good night, everybody. It's me, Eric, and I'm with George. We're just going to be discussing some of the latest research we've been doing. I think just continuing here to start off, go. If you guys watched the last hangout we did, I was focusing in on the media personalities that have originated from Jesuit Georgetown University, the key strategic outpost for the order in the United States that was erected by Jesuit priest John Carroll, S.J. John Carroll, S.J.'s nephew, if people aren't aware, Robert Brent, became the first mayor of Washington, D.C. And John Carroll, S.J.'s, the Jesuits' brother, Charles Carroll, was educated by the Jesuits at the College of the St. Omers for 17 years. And he was a signer on the on the Declaration of Independence, and was one of the wealthiest Americans at the time. So it's good. It's important background information for people to know. The Georgetown is a very key strategic outpost for the Vatican in the U.S., and that's why we see if you guys want especially like military generals. That's why so many generals have gone to Georgetown, in particular, like David Petraeus, for instance, Joseph Dunford, the current chief of staff. But that's people. I recommend people should maybe we'll do that on a future show. Go through the military list. But highlighting some of the media personalities, I wanted to cover this guy here because the people aren't aware. The company Condé Nast Inc., an American mass media company which was founded in 1909 by Con Montrose Nast. And we're going to see Con Montrose Nast, the founder of Condé Nast Inc., went to Jesuit Georgetown University, where he was a classmate of Robert Collier of Collier Magazine, which we covered on the last show. But Condé Nast Inc., who was founded by Jesuit-trained Con Montrose Nast, currently owns Allure Magazine, which is an American women's magazine. They own Architectural Digest, an American monthly. They owned Ars Technica, a web magazine and technology. They own Back Channel, an online magazine, another tech magazine. They own Bon Appetit, a big food magazine. They own the Brides magazine, an American bi-monthly. They own the Condé Nast Traveler. They own the Epicurious, a digital brand or a cooking magazine. They own Glamour, another women's magazine. They own Golf Digest. They own the GQ magazine. That's probably the biggest one on, or that's probably the GQ is pretty prominent. They also own Pitchfork. Pitchfork is owned by Condé Nast, which was founded by Jesuit-trained Con Montrose Nast. Pitchfork, if people are music fans, they've definitely come across this site. This is one of the biggest music review sites on the internet. But the Condé Nast also owns Self magazine. They own Teen Vogue. They own the New Yorker. They own Vanity Fair. They own Vogue. Vanity Fair and Vogue are like fashion magazines. And then they own the W magazine, another fashion magazine. And they own the Wired magazine. They have 164 million consumers. That's like that's pretty substantial. That's bordering on Hearst Corporation influence. But Condé Nast, the founder of the Condé Nast Corporation, went to Georgetown University, where he was a member of the Georgetown Philodemic Society. So he was very involved while at Jesuit Georgetown. And he was a classmate of Robert Collier, who was in charge of Collier's Weekly. Interestingly, it just says here he's buried near Babe Ruth. Interesting side fact, but his name's Condé Nast here, the prominent media businessman. He went to Georgetown. The next one I'm just going to go through here is a Fox analyst, Greta von Susteren. Greta von Susteren's been on CNN, Fox, and NBC News, but she's got her current show on Fox. Her current show is called For the Record with Greta, and again, people aren't aware, Fox is owned by a Knight of St. Gregory the Great, Rupert Murdoch. But Greta von Susteren, she went to Roman Catholic Xavier High School and went to Jesuit Georgetown University. And she's a member of the Church of Scientology. And I thought this was interesting. During the coverage of the O.J. Simpson murder trial, which I've showed on my channel. The three lawyers for O.J. Simpson. You had Robert Kardashian, Roman Catholic, who went to the University of San Diego, and like this O.J. Simpson trial is actually what brought like the Kardashians into like the spotlight, and now like they're famous for just being famous. And actually, I did a video on this. Kim Kardashian, in a Vogue magazine article. Vogue is owned by Condé Nast Inc., founded by Jesuit-trained Condé Nast. But Kim Kardashian actually said in a Vogue magazine article that she credits her Catholic schooling. She credited her work ethic to her Catholic schooling. But it's just interesting. I'm mentioning that because the O.J. Simpson trial is actually what brought the Kardashians on the scene, and O.J.'s two other lawyers, Robert Kardashian and Robert Chaparro, were trained by the Jesuits at Loyola Marymount. But this Greta von Susteren was on CNN at the time, and she was regularly covering the O.J. Simpson murder trial as a, quote, legal analyst on the news. And this Greta is very prominent. Like she's had high profile interviews. Like she interviewed George W. Bush, Mike Pence, John Kerry, Jesuit trained Skull and Bones, John Kerry, Bush's Skull and Bones also. If people aren't aware with Mike Pence, I don't know if you know this, George. This guy's a big current Jesuit coadjutor in the U.S. government. Is Keith Kellogg. He's currently Mike Pence's national security advisor. He assumed that position in 2018, but this Keith Kellogg went to Santa Clara, and he's Mike Pence's national security advisor. And George, you're mentioning the 101st Airborne Division. It says Keith Kellogg was a commander, or he was at the 101st Airborne Division during the Vietnam War. Interestingly here, he was served in Operation Desert Storm, and it says here, actually, yeah, this is what I want to mention. Keith Kellogg supposedly was in the Pentagon during the September 11th attacks. Doubtlessly, he was, plotting 9/11 from the inside. But I just wanted to bring that up with Mike Pence, if people aren't aware. His, quote, national security advisor, Keith Kellogg, was trained by the Jesuits. And Keith Kellogg, before this position, was the executive secretary on the National Security Council.
Well, Mike Pence, the current U.S. Vice President, during 9/11, he was actually in the U.S. House of Representatives representing Indiana, and he later went on to become the governor of that state. Well, he I mentioned this in the show before you joined us. This is last year that there's a speech that you can catch of Mike Pence when he was encouraging when he was talking about the then pending Patriot Act. Not only did he vote for it, but he encouraged his other fellow congressmen to vote for it. This is something that either Johnny or Felipe mentioned. One of Pence's daughters, I don't know her name, graduated from DePaul, Chicago. Also, something I mentioned on the show last year is that Pence's brother, Greg, went to law school at Loyola, Chicago. And he ran for, Greg Pence ran for Mike's old seat in Indiana.
Oh, great information. Did he win that? That's Greg Pence went to Loyola?
Yes, he went to Loyola, Chicago Law School.
Oh, great information. Well, that's probably why Mike Pence picked the Jesuit-trained Keith Kellogg to be his national security advisor. He's very familiar, with the quote, the Jesuit worldview. I'm sure he is.
Well, I know this is purely Jesuitical theater. I mentioned him before. The current mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Peter Joseph Buttigieg, or Buttigieg. Well, okay. Well, I'm not trying to be facetious, but it looks as if it should be pronounced Buttigieg. I know.
Oh no, George, quickly with Buttigieg, can you just run down some of his Jesuit credentials? Just because I remember just at the time when you were breaking it down, like I thought, damn, this guy could be like a lay Jesuit.
Well, okay. Well, his dad, Joe, and his mom, they were both professors at Notre Dame. South Bend is where Notre Dame is located. Pete went to St. Mary's Catholic High School in South Bend. Now, currently, he and his, quote, husband, end quote, Chazin Glisman, they attend an Episcopal church. which is, as I said before, the Episcopal Church is basically the American version of the Anglican Church. Now, as far as I'm concerned, both the Episcopal and the Anglican Church are just simply subsidiaries of the Vatican. They seem to own churches and denominations outright, but that's besides the point. So, as I said, Glisman, his partner, he also grew up Roman Catholic, and he got his master's degree from the aforementioned DePaul University. But Pete's dad, Joe, he went to an SJ school in England. I forgot the name of it. I could go look it up. I'm sure you could. You could go look it up. It wasn't Stonyhurst, but it was like one of those. So his dad was actually born in Malta, and in addition to being the mayor of South Bend, Pete Buttigieg was also an officer of the U.S. Naval Reserves, and he ended up spending something like 7 months in active duty in Afghanistan. Now, as I've said to you before, I mentioned this on the show a while back. I'm not sure how many people know this, but Afghanistan is a landlocked country. That is to say, it does not border any ocean or sea. The U.S. Navy cannot get there, therefore, through one of their vessels. So, why is the U.S. Navy in Afghanistan? Okay, in my opinion, no branch of the U.S. military should be there, but especially the Navy,
Well,
because
probably I would say to get the heroin onto the ships and then transport the Afghani opium across the world.
yes.
I would say
Now,
that's my educated guess.
okay, yes. Now, Bucky has a reputation for being quite the polyglot. He knows, in addition to English, he knows French, Italian, Spanish, Norwegian, Arabic, probably, I presume, Latin. So he probably knows at least 7 or 8 different languages.
Yeah, and I think that was yeah. I think that when you're bringing that up, I think that was the fact that got me thinking he could be like we're definitely like trained by the Jesuits.
Oh, yes.
That's very like the Jesuits are like you could say like they're like the like the masters at knowing multiple languages. Like the top Jesuits will know like 6 or 7 languages.
Oh, at least. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, definitely at least yeah.
well, okay. I mean, even though technically speaking, he was not a Jesuit, John Paul II, D. Carol Wojtyla, was supposed to have known, to varying degrees, over 20 different languages, including his, besides his native Polish. He spoke Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Italian, German, Russian, uh, some working knowledge of Japanese, and several other, languages. So it seems as if you're going to be, if you're going to rule the world, you need to know, the languages.
Oh, absolutely. When during the Paraguayan reductions, then that's how the Jesuits were able to get the Guarani and Indians like under their submission. Is like they took the time to actually learn the Guarani language, and like wherever they go, like the Jesuits, have taken the time to actually learn the language of the locals. And there's some funny, there's some good reading in Theodore Greisinger's book, The History of the Jesuits, on Saint Francis Xavier's first travels to India. But he talks about it's entertaining because he puts a good description in the reader's head because Xavier didn't know any of the language like whatsoever. So it's a huge it's a huge barrier and you don't know the language. But yeah, it's important to note that the Jesuits are very good. And actually, I covered this on a previous show. Like during the right around 1942, the Jesuits had like a special program in place where they were actually the source for this was in the John Cooney's book, The American Pope. I put that on my archive.org page. But the Jesuits were training like special Jesuit priests in Russian to send them into the Soviet Union.
Okay, so is this like a, so this is something, speaking of which, that reminds me, um, there's just something, if you listen to mainstream American media or even left wing, it seems as if the Cold War never ended. Russia is now the bad guy again, and it's just like you've had all this theater for 2.5 years, like Vladimir Putin, rigged the election, the U.S. election back in 2016, and that was how Donald Trump was able to get in. And you also have a backstory and a side story and a backyard story that, oh yes, well, not only did Russia interfere with the presidential election, Donald Trump and his organization obstructed with the whole investigation. And so you basically have almost like a Watergate type situation where you have all these people being propped up over, say, aha, the Russians, the
Yeah, a good
Russians.
example of this, like Keith Olbermann on a recent show, literally had like a meltdown where he was like screaming, like Trump is an agent of Putin. We cannot have this. Like it was crazy. Like he was literally like I'm just like you can see like just like looked like he looked completely mentally unstable. But he was like ranting like about how Trump is like a puppet of Putin, like yelling. Keith Olbermann, I think he has his own like news channel now. He's not on like a major cable news, but he still has like somewhat of a following. But I know Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. She's Roman Catholic, is she not? I know she's been pushing this. She like in terms of like all the mainstream media pundits, like she's been screaming the Trump's like is an agent of Putin. She's been literally screaming that for like 2.5 years.
Well, so Rachel Maddow is a mixture, like Ben Stiller, like Don Adams. She's both Jewish and Catholic. So it's good to have that mixture because you can play the whole psyop. Oh yes, of course. People will hone in that she's partially Jewish. See, it's the Jews who run everything.
Oh, and you know what? I just had a thought. Just the person who's doubtlessly giving her orders at MSNBC is John Brennan, the Jesuit trained at Fordham, currently chairing the Fordham Security Council. CIA agent John Drone Strike Brennan. He's on MSNBC like 5 or 6 days a week. And and I saw in the video I did on Bill Maher. I'm just remembering like John Brennan. He in terms of the RussiaGate, he's been like one of like the actual like the biggest voices of RussiaGate. Like on Bill Maher, he was calling like if anyone who supports Vladimir Putin is a traitor, and he was saying stuff like that. Just gaslighting people about Putin being like a traitor, and ultimately like with Putin, like Putin, I would say is a puppet of the U.S. It's like it's the other way around when you start looking into it.
Oh, okay.
So you have to realize like economically, like the Soviet Union, like how like Bill Clinton's administration, like when Yeltsin was in power, like the Clinton administration gave like at least 60. I want to say it like it could have been over $1 billion, but like the source I saw was at least $60 million annually in foreign aid to the Soviet, like to Russia. From the U.S. If you understand, like, the history of the Soviet Union, like American technology has like built Russia to its current state. And like the CIA, I think was working with Putin with his like 1999 bombing incident with the FSB. If people aren't aware, the FSB, I have a documentary of this incident on my channel. There's 4 apartment building bombings around Moscow. The bombs contained hexogen in them. There was a 5th one that was going to go off in Ryazan, a city a few hours outside of Moscow. But there was a diligent person at the apartment building who saw these vehicles and people loading large bags outside of the vehicles. Long story short, you can watch the documentary on my channel. It's called "The Assassination of Russia." It turns out though that like the police were called. They found out that a bomb was supposed to go off at 5:30. But long story short, this is covered in the documentary. The people who were the only suspects they found related to this bomb that was supposed to go off were FSB agents. And Putin was a member of the FSB. The first thing Putin did when he came into power was pardon Yeltsin from impending corruption allegations. And there's the famous soundbite of Yeltsin was drunk at the White House with Jesuit-trained Bill Clinton, and they're like laughing their asses off. And Yeltsin was like an American puppet his whole administration, just like Putin is. Like Yeltsin went to see the Pope. That's why Putin has kept his close relations with the Pope as well. And after 9/11, and the key thing is that the U.S. government remained completely silent when Putin and the FSB like were bombing their own people in Russia. So they're working together, and the key thing though is after in 2002 there was a joint NATO-Russia National Security Summit that took place in Rome. The key is where it took place. The summit between NATO and Russia took place in Rome, of all places, which is absolutely not a coincidence. But in this summit, like Russia said, we're going to join together with NATO to fight the war on terrorism. Like how Jesuitical is that? And Russia is literally a police state at this point. Like Putin is like the Tsar of Russia. He's going to be in power now for another 6 years. He'll be in power longer than Joseph Stalin. Jesuit-trained Joseph Stalin. By the time he's done, he's remained close with the Vatican. Like all the wealth in Russia is like centered in like the oligarch class. Like the wealth inequality in Russia is like almost even worse than America. It's like it's a police state. There's absolutely no press freedom. Like the press freedom in Russia makes America look like it's in a good situation.
Well, Eric, if we just back up for a moment, you were talking about Georgetown alumni. I read a book a couple years ago. It was called The King's Advisor. It was about a fellow named John Jack Connell or O'Connell. I had to go find the name of the book. Turns out, and I sent Johnny the information on this something like 2 years ago, and it was like this fellow was born in the 1920s. He died back in 2010. I believe he went to Georgetown for his undergrad degree, went to Notre Dame for his law degree or something like that. And he was the station bureau, he was the CIA chief in Jordan back in the late 1960s or throughout the 1960s. And he served as the advisor to King Hussein II. King Hussein II lived from 1935 to 1999. He was married 4 times. And it's interesting because, as I said, I don't know the exact demographics, but Jordan is almost exclusively Muslim. It's like 99% Muslim. You're talking for the most part Sunni. And give you, well, anyhow, but if you, as I said, Hussein was married 4 times. And if you look at his third wife, Alia, I'm probably not going to say this correctly, Alia Bahauddin Tauken. She lived from 1948 to 1977. So she wasn't even 30 years old, but she died in, I guess, allegedly in a helicopter crash. So I don't know exactly I mean, if it were a legitimate crash, I mean, yes, it was a crash, but I'm not sure if the helicopter was sabotaged. Now, interesting, she was Jordanian, but she got her undergrad degree from Loyola Chicago. Then, after the death of his third wife, he married Lisa Halaby, who's actually an American. And Halaby okay, Halaby and King Hussein. Now, Halaby was his 4th and final wife, and she's still alive. She was born in 1951. She and King Hussein II had 4 children together, one of whom is Prince Hussein III. So he was born in 1981. And he went to the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Services, where he got his undergrad degree. So,
very interesting. Well, George, with the King Hassan, this week I found something interesting on him. That Vernon Walters, the Jesuit-trained Knight of Malta, like roving ambassador, was the deputy director of the CIA. Walters is a very long, nefarious career, but in the 40s, I found Vernon Walters, and again, Walters, for the viewers, was trained by the Jesuits in England at Stonyhurst College, and was a Knight of Malta. But Walters, it says during, I have two sources for this. One is from a Catholic priest, actually, and another one is from the LaRouche magazine, the Executive Intelligence Review. This magazine does occasionally have good information. But it says here from the 1942-1943 period, Vernon Walters came into contact with the Crown Prince Hassan of Morocco, now King Hassan II. His lasting connections to Hassan have made him the key to nasty operations in the Maghreb. And I'll link these articles because this article on Walters is very interesting because Walters, if it goes into, he was like one of Avril Harriman's quote personal assistants. And it goes into that, but this is from a Catholic priest here. I'll get to the name of this priest. This is from Crisis Magazine, from Father George W. Rutler. But he mentions Vernon Walters with the King of Morocco. It says, as an aide to General Mark Clark. General Mark Clark, I found, was a Knight of Malta. That's sourced in the Covert Action Information Bulletin 25. But continuing here, as an aide to Mark Clark, Walters entered Rome in triumph in 1944, giving a ride on his tank to the future King Hassan of Morocco. But, I thought that was very interesting. So, like, the Jesuit-trained Vernon Walters is reaching out to King Hassan II. And Hassan, if people aren't aware, was like a brutal dictator. Like, he turned Morocco into a police state. The CIA actually, set up, they trained, like, the police forces and the military forces in Morocco.
Okay, so it seems almost redundant to do this. Whether you're talking about Jordan, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Japan, the list is almost on and on and on. Rome controls all these countries through their governments. It is usually through education, if not the actual leader, his spouse, his children, a secret society, being type of being a Freemason or something like it, being some sort of knight, not necessarily a Knight of Malta, but it could be like their equivalent of it. Like in Japan, you have the Order of the Rising Sun. So, and of course, you have advisors like CIA operatives who are acting as like chief of staffs. So that is how these leaders are not, for the most part, acting in the best interest of their people. They're acting in the best interest of the Rome and of the Jesuits.
So absolutely, and that's why I think that's why I thought it was fascinating to me that it's very predictable, but just knowing the Jesuits' role in history, but you see that there's no coincidence why a Jesuit-trained guy like Vernon Walters becomes like a personal assistant to the King Hussein of Morocco before he takes power. You see, with connections like that, the Jesuits are able to get their foot in the door and then exert their will over these rulers.
And of course, they'll usually use it through proxies. The advisors, generally speaking, won't be wearing a collar. They'll usually wear a suit and tie, and to make them seem, completely innocuous. And so they say, hey, you know what? Maybe you should invade this country, or maybe you should launch an airstrike against, that country, or maybe you should gas, this ethnic group, this minority ethnic group, to create tension in your, country. And they say, oh, okay, if you think that's a good idea, I'll do it. And sometimes, as a case of like Muammar Gaddafi, and there have been a few others here and there, he said, you know what? I don't think that's a good idea. I'd rather, rule my own people. I don't want to trade our currencies in U.S. dollars. I'd rather do it in deniers or euros or something like that. And when that happens, well, there goes your administration, and usually there goes your life.
Yeah, we know that Goulart in Brazil, and they're in the early 1960s, decided he was going to give the wealth of Brazil to Brazilian corporations, not American corporations. And he he died very shortly after making that decision.
Well, I was talking to Johnny last week on the phone, and I'm of the opinion, I know may sound a bit jaundiced, but as a general rule, it is a job of historians to make sure people don't learn anything about the past. The job of journalists to make sure people don't know about current events. And it is the job of filmmakers to make sure people don't know about either one, the past or the present.
We know, I'd say in this like Jesuitized society we live, that's what has occurred. And
Okay,
actually,
and
no, it's just Theodore Geisinger. Just and I was reading his book, The History of the Jesuits. He mentions in that book how there was this book called the Solipsum that was written by this Jesuit in the 17th century. But this book Solipsum was all about the Jesuits creating like a kingdom of Solipsum. But part of the kingdom of Solipsum was like the Jesuits controlling all means of like information within the society.
well,
It's just an interesting side fact because like the Solipsum kingdom has been in like a Jesuit utopia model for how a society should be run. And and that's
well,
what our that's what our society is ultimately turning into. Like it's turning into like a utopiastic model where like all of like the masses are like bound to like their corporation personhood contracts with like most people are stuck working like paycheck to paycheck, completely entrapped, in within the system, and like the cartel capitalists on top are just making billions and billions. Like think about the 2008 recession, for instance. Like one guy, Angelo Mazzillo, with the countrywide financial crash, like he got paid. One guy got paid like $400 million. The total amount of payouts to the top CEOs during the recession was in like the billions and billions. But I'm saying, but like
so
it's
you're
turning
saying
into
he
like
basically,
a socialistic, crony capitalistic utopia where all the wealth is in like the top class, and then like the serfs are on at the bottom.
well, how I just mentioned a moment ago, it seems as if it is jobs of historians to make sure people don't know anything about the past. Well, this is a controversial topic, more so in the U.S. because I imagine it's not as been a big deal in Canada. But in the last decade or so, there has been a big push in the United States, particularly in the South, uh, to rename schools, to remove statues of Confederate figures like Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, or things like that, because people say, well, they're racist and they remind us of slavery and things like that. Whether that's true, that's a different story. But I'd imagine, I, I don't have any proof of this, but I imagine the Jesuits are behind this because they love fomenting agitation, black on white. And that reminds me of a line from Orwell's 1984. The main protagonist of it is Winston Smith, who works for the Ministry of Truth. And there's a line in there where it basically says, "Those who control the past control the future." And if you get rid of these statues, if you rename these schools, uh, you're basically erasing your past. In order to, sometimes, it's good to look at what happened 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and it may not be very pleasant, or 170 years ago, the case, or whatever. It may not be very pleasant, and it may be ugly, but you have to look at the past to see what you could possibly learn. Now, case in point, I'm reading a book right now from my local library. It's called These Here United States. Uh, it's called The History of America from 1890 to the present being 2015 when the book came out. One of the authors of it is I could go look this up, is Thomas Suggs. Um, so he's going through all the events, said, about 100 until 5 years or 4 years ago. Uh, and and I was reading about the JFK assassination, and it was incredibly insulting because it's just incredibly sloppy. And he was talking about the idealism of JFK becoming the president and being the first openly Roman Catholic president. And I said openly Roman Catholic president. And Thomas Segru is his name. He was born in 1962 in Detroit, Michigan. He's an American historian who went to Brother Rice High School in Detroit, Michigan. So, and anyhow, according to C Group, uh, it was a crazed loner gunman who was kicked out of the Marines.
I was
Lee
just saying,
Harvey
like all the historians just like spinelessly like dogmatically the Warren Report.
Yes.
Pretty much all like it. You'll never hear like a historian in like a university class question the Warren Report. I doubt you'll hear it.
And I just really, I mean, what an incredibly indolent, slothful writer. I mean, he didn't even acknowledge that. He could have said, well, according to the Warren Report, which came out the following year, or which was, well, actually didn't come out. It was convened in 64, but it wasn't released until 1974. Um, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And he could have thrown just a sentence or two and say, well, this is according to the official story. What actually happened is a matter of debate. Now, that would have been a little bit more honest. However, something we have discussed before, you and I, and Johnny has done, is it seems as if that the Jesuits seem to be hell bent on killing us physically through the militarized police forces, the military intelligence, um, through all the garbage they're feeding us through Monsanto and GMOs and chemtrails. But they seem to be bent on killing us intellectually.
Oh, absolutely. Well,
Because,
they've been successful. Like we're dealing with a very like historically ignorant like population.
yes, and sorry about that. So,
No, no problem.
I about another half an hour or so. Uh,
No, it sounds good with me. No,
okay,
but
so
I tell people like to picture this like I guess like the intellectual comparison between like the Jesuits and like the average like American like Stromio Americano an average just like a tax-paying American citizen. Like you have to be like the intellectual apparatus like it's just like picture like a massive Apache helicopter like going up against like a dandelion in a fight. Like who's gonna win? Like the Jesuit intellectual power would be the Apache helicopter versus like the average the average American, the average like the masses everywhere. Like people are very disengaged in these times. Preoccupied with nonsense. In the media, and people could care less about history. Like most out. I'd say it's over like 50% of the population. Doesn't like read like at all. I think that's a fair estimate. And most people who do read, like are just reading like nonsense, like fiction stories, or just like extremely watered down, quote unquote, like what you get on like the New York Times bestseller list, like just extremely watered down history. Most of it, is propaganda. At the end of the day.
well, I don't mean to keep harping on this, but as I said, five times this last semester, I went to my alma mater, Sonoma State, for the Holocaust Memorial. And something, as I've said before, uh, at least three of the speakers had some sort of nexus with Rome. One grew up Irish Roman Catholic. One teaches at a Catholic university in New York, Manhattan, even though she herself is Muslim. And the other one taught at a Catholic school in Germany in the early 1990s. And as I said, the facilitators of these lectures, Diane Parnas, got her PhD from Georgetown. So her job and the job of these speakers and presenters is to make sure people don't know who was actually responsible for the Holocaust in Nazi Europe in the 1930s and 40s, and who has been responsible for all the other Holocausts, the Armenians, the teens, what happened in Yugoslavia in the 1940s, what happened in Rwanda in the 1990s. And I just need to clarify something. Now, we throw around these words like genocide and Holocaust. Well, I think it'd be better just to call them what they actually are, reductions. Uh, the Jesuits want to diminish the population in a certain area of a certain group for some reason, or they want them to move somewhere else. They want, for example, this is according to Eric John Phelps, they wanted people, for Catholic Irishmen, to move from Ireland in the 1840s and 50s to other places, mostly the United States. Some did remain fairly close in England, somewhat Australia, but the majority of them went to the United States. And so they could move into the Northeast, places like Boston, Massachusetts, and New York City, and later Chicago, San Francisco, and take them over. That was, and of course, according to Eric John Phelps, there was no potato famine. That was completely manufactured. And, Phelps can say some goofy things, and I'm not here to I'm not here to address, him. However, that would seem to make sense because the Jesuits realized at the beginning of the 19th century, and they probably realized this before that, they said, well, what was basically became the United States in the late 18th century was almost exclusively Protestant. Now, granted, even though almost all the founding fathers were Freemasons, the majority of the new Americans were some type of Protestants. They're Anglicans, Congregationalists, Presbyterian, Baptist, and others. So we need to say, you know what? We need to change those demographics. And so by the year, I remember reading in the year 1776, when America became a country, the population was about 4 million. 98% of that was some type of Protestant. However, by the year 1850, this is according to L. Francis Rooney in the quote, global end quote, Vatican, the US population was 10% Roman Catholic. And in places like Boston, Mass, it was like 20%. So now the figure is really hard to say. It's somewhere between 20 and 25% officially. Whereas in places like LA County, it's something like 50%. And you're getting those numbers in places like California, LA County, because of the massive influx of Hispanics who are coming to America. I know you did a video last year for the Catholic News Channel, EWTN, and about the border town of Laredo, Texas. Well, Laredo population is probably about 95% Hispanic, and the vast majority of the people there are Roman Catholic. So they basically have taken over large swaths of the country already.
Well, absolutely. And a key area is a study was done by Merger Watch, which is a group that looks at hospitals and medical companies who are merging. But now, as of 2016, 1 in 6 hospital beds in the U.S. are in a Catholic hospital. And the study goes into how there's 6 U.S. states where over 40% of the hospitals in the state are Catholic. There's over like 50 cities in the United States where there's the only hospital in the city is a Catholic hospital. It's like, and that's on my archive.org page. The Merger Watch study was done in 2016. You can find the report also on the Merger Watch website. And just quickly, I think that's with the potato famine. I don't think it was like a hoax. I think it definitely did happen, but like there was an agenda, behind it. You could say that even though Lord Robert Montagu goes into that a bit in his book on some recent events and included their solution. There's a few passages that allude to the Roman Catholic Church, being aware of the potato famine and encouraging it for the reason to move the Irish to the United States of America. And he goes into how like the Irish and the Americans, or the Irish Americans, were some of the biggest financial backers of the Fenian movement, which was kicking off around that time. But
well, as I said, not all passed ended up moving to the United States. The majority did. Large number of them went over to England because I guess they couldn't raise a fare to go across the Atlantic. And they ended up taking over places like Liverpool. And there's large sections of London now that are almost exclusively Irish Roman Catholic. They look like Boston, Massachusetts, or Chicago in terms of their demographics. And of course, a good number of them did end up going to places like Australia to change their demographics. Now, by the way, Eric, I just was talking a while ago about the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg, and who's also one of the candidates who's running for the Democratic nomination next year. Well, as I said, he's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, which is the location of Notre Dame University. Now, South Bend has a population of about 100,000 people. It's a decent-sized town, but it is not a major urban center. However, I'll send you this if I haven't done so already. If you just look at the people who are on his staff, as I said, South Bend has a population of like 105, 110,000 people. The executive staff, Laura O'Sullivan, chief of staff, she used to work for the University of Notre Dame. Jennifer Miller, deputy chief of staff and policy advisor. She got her undergrad degree from Notre Dame. Sherry Pete, I believe, Piat, director of community outreach. She's a member of she went to All Hallows College in Dublin, Ireland. She also got an undergrad degree from DePaul University in Chicago. And so she got her undergrad degree from DePaul University.
Very interesting. Well, I wonder, just Notre Dame here quickly. I have this up here. Maybe they're getting some of their financial backing from the Rockefeller Capital Management Trust Fund, just because one of the boards of directors, John J. Brennan at Rockefeller Capital Management, is the current chairman of the board of trustees at the University of Notre Dame.
So,
just interesting, just an interesting people. I think that's very significant. But yeah, Buttigieg, in terms of financing, he's no doubt being financed by some mega corporations.
Yes, and of course, I sent you some clips, but he seems to be the media darling. He's on all the talk shows: Jimmy Fallon, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, and
I wonder all the Catholic talk show hosts. But I wonder if they're sending him out there to take away votes, like young people who would vote for. Bernie Sanders is a controlled opposition candidate, and recently Bernie Sanders said that he would vote for Joe Biden, Jesuit Joe. But maybe Buttigieg is being sent out there to take away young voters from someone who would vote for a more, quote, progressive candidate like Bernie Sanders, so that more votes will be taken from Bernie. So it's more likely that someone like Joe Biden gets elected. I'm wondering if that's what they're going for.
Well, yeah, interesting you should mention Bernie Sanders. Of course, he's a walking caricature. I mean, he's like he's comic relief without even saying anything. However, of course, don't mean to keep playing this card or harping on this point. His wife is a Roman Catholic, Anne Mira or O'Mara or something like that, and is almost comical. So almost all your figures in the your major candidates who are running for the position. We've already talked about Becky. We've already talked about Joe Biden. We've talked about Bernie Sanders. Beto O'Rourke grew up Roman Catholic. He's one of the candidates. Elizabeth Warren.
Ocasio-Cortez wrote an op-ed in like the Jesuit America magazine even last year.
Yes. Now, as I said, Elizabeth Warren, technically speaking, is Protestant. She's a Methodist, but she has spoken at Boston College at least once. Kamala Harris. Warren is a senator from Massachusetts, and Harris is the junior senator from California. Beto O'Rourke is a politician from Texas. He ran against Ted Cruz, I believe. So I'm not sure if he's in office anywhere. Anyhow, Kamala Harris also, technically speaking, is Protestant. She grew up Baptist and sang in the Baptist choir. She has spoken. She actually 10 years ago gave the commencement speech at the University of San Francisco. Okay, one more, please.
All right, no problem. Well, while you take that, people aren't aware that the reason we're probably seeing like this mess of a Democratic opposition to Trump that has rolled out is because the chairman of the DNC, Tom Perez, is very tied into the Jesuits, to say the least. Like, I'll link this in the chat. I archived this. There's an article that was done by America Magazine in 2017 titled "New Democratic Party Leader Tom Perez Has Deep Jesuit Connections." And actually, there's some interesting. Look, Perez went to Jesuit-run Canisius High School. You can see a photo of when Pope Francis went to Canisius High School. Tom Perez attended, but his current wife Anne Marie Stoudemire met the current DNC head Tom Perez at the Jesuit Volunteer Corps in Buffalo. And just this article goes into Perez's role model is the late Jesuit Horace B. McKenna, S.J. But at the very top, in the key leadership position, they're completely controlled by the Jesuits, and that's why you were seeing all the Democratic Party candidates in the open being completely controlled by them. And just I want to mention some of these names. I'm just gonna. I'm going to mention some of these as the show keeps going, but to mention more media personalities from Jesuit Georgetown that I haven't covered is this name here, Anthony Tomopoulos. He was the former president of ABC Entertainment. He was a vice president and a president of ABC Entertainment and a president of ABC Broadcast Group. His name is Anthony Tomopoulos, Thomopoulos, high-profile media executive. He went to the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. So recommend people check that out because the Jesuits, they have key, alumni station in all the major media corporations. This one I wanted to bring up here, it's related to Snapchat. And if people aren't aware, I stopped using Snapchat because Snapchat uses facial recognition software, and I'm pretty sure the FBI doubtlessly and the CIA are using collecting information from Snapchat, getting into people's personal lives. But the current head of the head of Snapchat News, Peter Hamby, Hamby. He's the head of Snapchat News. He's a host of Good Luck America, a former CNN political reporter. Head of Snapchat News, Peter Hamby, went to Georgetown University. And he was a producer for Wolf Blitzer's show, also interestingly. Wolf Blitzer is a huge puppet. I knew like Wolf Blitzer was a puppet when I was like 11 years old, for instance. But there's a few other. I'll just if you want to jump in here, Jordan. I just want to mention a few more of the media personalities because like the Georgetown, just that the list of Georgetown, you see that like it's overwhelming that they control it all. We see here Tara McClevley, American journalist. And we mentioned on the last show we probably went through 4 or 5 different White House reporters. Tara McClevley is an American journalist, White House reporter for the BBC, and a former correspondent for Newsweek and the Daily Beast. She reports on national security issues, and she went to Georgetown University. And Tara McClevley, McClevey, was a professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where she taught a course at the Jesuit Georgetown University School of Foreign Service on national security and the media. So that's probably why we're seeing like the media just being absolutely controlled. Here's another connection to the Washington Post, which has a direct contract with the CIA. But Walter Haskell Pincus, another national security journalist. I think we're starting to see a theme occur here. But Walter Pincus is a national security journalist who reported for the Washington Post until the end of 2015. He's won several prizes, a Polk Award, an Emmy, a Pulitzer Prize, with the other Washington Post reporters in 2010. And he went to Walter Pincus. He's born of Jewish parents, but he went to the Georgetown School of Foreign Service.
Okay.
I think there's one other one I wanted to mention here. Oh, right here, Bloomberg. Yeah, so we know when Michael Bloomberg, the Jew, is campaigning for mayor of New York, Archbishop Cardinal Egan was openly campaigning for him. And we covered on the last show in terms of the media, Greg Smith, the current CEO of Bloomberg Media, went to Jesuit Georgetown, is on the board of directors. But this Eric, or is it, I guess how you pronounce it, Eric or Eric, A-R-I-C-K, Eric Wierson, W-I-E-R-S-O-N. He was an advisor to Bloomberg. He was an NYC Media General Manager, and he was Michael Bloomberg's media advisor while he was mayor. So he had Michael Bloomberg's media advisor here, Eric Wierson, was trained by the Jesuits. It says here he was described at one point as one of the most important people in New York media. And it says he is a regular contributor, Eric Wierson, to CNN, CNBC. It says here he's an advisor to the current president of Brazil, or the former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. Interestingly, this guy is very intriguing, and he speaks at the Manova. He speaks at like the global summits, like the World Economic Forum and stuff like that. Yeah, there's an interesting connection to Bloomberg, because when you look at Bloomberg, he's a great example of like a Jew who's running New York City, and there's swarms of Catholics in the background.
Well, that reminds me. You're talking about Michael Bloomberg, and we're talking about other Jewish people. Bernie Sanders. Well, just going back, we were talking earlier about the JFK assassination. Allegedly, according to the official story, Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman who killed Jack Kennedy, and a day or two later, Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, okay, I said those are the official stories. I'm not saying what actually happened. Well, Ruby, nee Jacob Rubenstein, is important because one, he is of a Jewish background, and two, he was affiliated with the Chicago mob. So you could say like they could use Ruby to say, see, well, it was the mob that killed Jack Kennedy, or maybe for to help muddy the waters.
Another great example, like David, Silverstein was, very brilliantly placed as like the president of the World Trade Center buildings during 9/11. He was immediately pointed to, oh look, it's still the Joe Silverstein controlling the WTC. It's a Zionist plot. Like the same thing with the Ruby situation.
Well, and of course, you did. We talked last year about this organization of which Brett Kavanaugh is a member, and Neil Gorsuch, the Federal Society, as are several other prominent judges at lower levels and DAs and attorney generals. Well, on the flip side, you have the right wing or the left wing response. You have the U.S. Constitution Society, which is founded by Peter Rubin, who also is of a Jewish background, but he got his law degree from Georgetown. So you have all these judges who are supposedly conservative, like Kavanaugh, like Gorsuch, like the late Antonin Scalia, but you had Ruth Bader Ginsburg and people of her ilk who are members of the American Constitution Society, like Larry Tribe. Larry Tribe, I believe, was a professor at Harvard, and he's been one of the strongest proponents of the impeachment of Donald Trump. So it's almost a cliche and almost a redundancy. Those are just so the Federal Society and the U.S. Constitution Society exemplify the Hegelian dialectic, how Roe plays both sides.
Well, I have another great example with Islam. So, Jesuit trained Frank Gaffney, the founder of the Council for National Policy. He was Frank Gaffney. He's like a national. He's a bureaucrat. He was trained at Georgetown. He's one of John Bolton's advisors, actually. But I mentioned this because Frank Gaffney is like one of the most vocal, like anti-Muslim, like one of the biggest anti-Muslim voices out there, especially in the U.S. government. So you have the dialectic of being like against, like or promoting like I guess like a witch hunt, or over exaggerating the threat of Islam coming from Frank Gaffney, and on the other end of the Jesuit dialectic, you have the Council on American Islamic Relations, which I know you mentioned, but which was founded by Omar Ahmad, Ahmad, and he went to Jesuit Santa Clara. And I found an interesting source here from the book from Craig Unger, House of Bush, House of Saud, that this Council on American Islamic Relations, which was founded by Jesuit-trained Omar Ahmad, was very anti-Semitic, which ties in with lots of the Jesuits have just a rich history of anti-Semitism. But suppose at a 1998 rally sponsored by the Council on American Islamic Relations, 500 people sang a song with the lyrics, quote, "No to the Jews, descendants of the apes," end quote. But I just wanted to know that that's another good example of the dialectic with the Council on American Relations being founded by Jesuit-trained Omar Ahmad. Then you have the anti-Islamic rhetoric coming from Jesuit-trained at Georgetown Frank Gaffney, the founder of the Council for National Policy.
Well, we talked on previous shows, as others have, that it was basically the Jesuits who founded the modern nation of Israel. They're behind the Holocaust and things like that. But they're also behind the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and there's pictures. You can go online and see a picture of Yasser Arafat meeting with John Paul II. And as I said, almost all your Arab and Middle Eastern leaders are controlled by Rome.
Do you know if any of these guys were members of the Club of Rome, I'm just saying this because I found out that Mikhail Gorbachev became a member of the Club of Rome think tank. Like many like former presidents of all sorts of countries joined the Club of Rome.
Um, I had to go look into him. I'm only vaguely familiar with Yasser Arafat. So he was constantly fomenting agitation, like between the Palestinians and the Israeli government. So his actions are almost. I'm sure he must have had an S.J. Handler who was telling him what to do. And people were saying, "Boy, back in the 1980s, why wasn't Yasser Arafat killed because of all of his activity? Why didn't the Mossad take him out? It wasn't as if they didn't know where he lived. Well, it was because he was working. The Mossad and Yasser Arafat had the same paymasters.
I would agree.
And
I had to look into more of the current Palestinian situation. But yeah,
well,
they're definitely being controlled on. The Pope has been calling for a two-state solution. So like it's being controlled on both sides.
and of course, you know, you have people being frothed up. You know, unfortunately, you have Protestants who are being frothed up. They're talking about the Muslim boogeyman. And something that Johnny has mentioned before, in his humble opinion and semi-professional opinion, there's no such thing as modern jihad. The the threat that is posed to the West from the Arab world is almost certainly being galvanized by Western intelligence, specifically the CIA. There are other organizations like British MI6, the Mossad, and so forth, and they're being funded by Western intelligence agencies. For the most part, you're talking about uh, American taxpayers unwittingly. So they have, so the American soldiers are being paid to go into places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth to kill the locals. But the American people are also being paid to support organizations like ISIS, which is an intelligence creation, as we discussed in the previous show. So, but this is something that's been going on for a long time. The American taxpayers basically helped fund the creation of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. The American taxpayers, and to a lesser extent, the British taxpayers, helped to create the Third Reich and help build.
And the Soviet Union at the same time.
Yes. So
And
even
think
though
about like with the military budget, like $750 billion, but like think about like at most the United States needs to be spending like 5 billion on their military. But like with that 745 billion, just think about all of the improvements they could make to the lives of Americans. Like 700, you could end homelessness in America like 10 times over, 50 times over with that much money. Put a few million to repair. Like most of the roads in America haven't been updated since like the interstate system was created in the 50s under Eisenhower. Like the infrastructure is falling apart. You could put money
and
to
of course,
rebuild libraries, but like people don't really like $750 billion. Like the U.S. is spending just an insane amount of money on the military. And
well,
that thing has changed. Like like that. It was really like under Truman. It was like it's really been the same. Like for like since the two world wars. Like it's for like 100 years. Like the United States has been spending like a colossal sum of its budget on the military. Like I would say almost like a psychopathic like level. And when people realize like the U.S. military, like there's U.S. military like Asia Command, there's like Africa Command, South America Command, Europe Command. U.S. has military bases, in like hundreds of countries all over the world. Like the military, like it's a massive complex they have set up.
and of course, I mean, we're talking about the Irish potato famine or the alleged potato famine back 160, 170 years ago. And well, the Jesuits are good at manufacturing problems, crises. Something I mentioned 1 or 2 shows ago was what happened in Somalia in the early 1990s. The U.S. ambassador at the time, as I said, was James Bishop, who got his undergrad degree from Holy Cross. And so, without going into all the details as to what happened, you had a civil war break out between the various warlords, and you had this whole nightmarish situation to where tens of thousands of Somalis fled their country. Some went into Europe, others went into the United States, and specifically Minnesota, which is traditionally Minnesota has had the largest individual religious body in Minnesota has been the Lutheran Church, and the majority of the people from Minnesota are from Scandinavia and other Germanic countries.
Well, I know, yeah.
And
There's a Martin Luther Seminary in St. Paul.
yes, so I think they did that on purpose. It partially as a joke is like because I mean, say what you will about the Jesuits, they do like a good laugh, and they have a wonderful sense of humor, uh, which is why they produce so many good comedians, like uh, Bob Newhart, like James Gafferty or Gaffigan, um, and so if I don't mean to be abrupt, but unfortunately, I do need to call it an evening.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah,
So I guess we'll have to do another show within the next week or so.
yeah, I'll be free. Yeah, I'm just working here.
Oh, okay. And I'd just like to apologize. I've had some technical issues over the weekend, so I'll be sending you out some more material, and uh, and I'll definitely send you a list of things I'd like to talk to you about. Oh, okay. I just want to mention one other thing. This has been in the hopper for a while. I wanted to talk about an actor named Edward Herman, who was best known for his narrations of American documentaries. He did a portrayal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he did a bunch of work with PBS. And in the 1990s, this public broadcasting system, PBS released the Why We Fight series, and he actually narrated that. And well, Herman grew up Unitarian, but as an adult, he converted to the Catholic Church. And I just wanted to mention that because, as I said, he was a very popular narrator for documentaries.
So great information, and yeah, Why We Fight was directed by Knight of Malta, Frank Capra. That's
Yes.
the official biography on him. But and just quickly before we go, I wanted to mention this tonight was I found this sourced in the National Catholic NCWC News Service Bulletin from 1965, which is it showed papal infiltration into Protestant sects. But there was the man named here, Dr. Hubert Peter Morrison, was a Protestant publisher. I'm going to quote here from the NC. This is short here. It's only be a couple minutes. But Dr. Hubert Peter Morrison, Protestant publisher, who for 12 years has worked on a Catholic edition of the American Protestant version of the Bible, has been made a papal knight. Pope Paul VI named him the Knight of Saint Gregory the Great in recognition of his services for Christian unity, and the honor was conferred to him on December the 12th by Archbishop Gordon Gray of St. Andrews. And Morrison was the president of the Thomas Nelson and Sons, a Protestant publishing company which held the British copyright to the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. That was produced by American scholars from the Rockefeller-funded National Council of Churches. But interestingly, also, so Dr. Hubert Peter Morrison was knighted, a prominent Protestant publisher, and also here it was Dr. Luther A. Weigel was knighted as a Knight of St. Gregory the Great, and he was the Dean Emeritus of the Yale Divinity School. And Dr. Weigel, Luther Weigel, who was made a Knight of St. Gregory the Great, served as the chairman of the Committee of Scholars which prepared the new version of the so-called King James Bible. I just want to mention to that. So, two evidence, in the 60s, that this was right around, Vatican II, was kicking off, and they were handing out knighthoods to Protestant publishers. I'll link this in the chat before we sign off.
Okay, something you mentioned in one of your videos you'd done recently was that if you look at almost all the major events of the 20th century, and therefore of the 21st century, Rome in general and the Jesuits in particular had a hand in it. Rock and roll, television, World War II, all the battles, the advent of fast food restaurants. The founders of most of your fast food chains are Catholics or Freemasons, or a combination thereof. Something we mentioned before. But actually, you weren't actually on the show. Carl Karcher, Carl's Jr., was a devout Roman Catholic, Knight of Malta. One of his sons ended up being a priest. And Carl's Jr. is one of the probably top 10 popular fast food restaurants in America. We talked a couple weeks ago about Ted Portion, the fact that he's Catholic, went to a Catholic school. In almost every facet of your life, banking, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan.
Actually, just quick on Chase Manhattan, George. I found a big connection to Chase Manhattan. Let me, I don't know if you saw this. Let me pull up Francis X. Stankard. Did you see what I sent there? I'll show you. I'll pull this up here. This guy was like the president of Chase Manhattan Bank's international department. This is quoted from the Chase website here. Francis X. Stankard. He was executive vice president for international banking at Chase Manhattan from 1975 to 1991. He was also on the board of the Chase Manhattan Overseas Banking Corporation from 1987 to 1992. He also joined American Express Bank as a chairman. There's more banks he was affiliated with. I just want to cut to the chase. Francis X. Stankard was a graduate of the Jesuit College of the Holy Cross and was a Jesuit Holy Cross trustee from 1984 to 1992. He also served as a gift chair for every reunion year for the class of 1953 and as class agent. Francis X. Stankard was also a member of the Jesuit Holy Cross Advisory Board since its inception in 2006, and he was the national chair of the Jesuit Holy Cross Fund from 1980 to 1983, and was an inaugural member of the Holy Cross Leadership Council of New York. It says Stankard was a Knight of Malta, and it says here from the Chase website, an elite Roman Catholic knighthood, headed by a Grand Master who works at the behest of the Pope. Stankard was also a trustee emeritus at the Asia Society. But this guy was also Opus Dei. I've seen sources. This is a huge connection to Chase Manhattan Bank in particular. Chase Manhattan Bank made a Catholic priest, Teddy Hesburgh, a member of their board of directors in 1972. People aren't aware. The same Teddy Hesburgh was on the Council on Foreign Relations and the Rockefeller Foundation. Those organizations control all facets of American economic life. And then in the same email, another huge key Vatican agent was William Simon, Secretary of the Treasury during the 70s. Simon was another Knight of Malta, and I found here from the William Simon Foundation website, he was given the Ignatian Medal from Jesuit Gregorian University. He was given also William Simon was given the Blessed Hyacinth Cormier Award for Outstanding Catholic Leadership, honorary doctorate from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas. William Simon co-founded a Westray Corporation, which pioneered a merger and and acquisitions. He was on the board of literally over 30 companies, the biggest companies in America: Halliburton, Xerox, Citibank, United Technologies. Like the guy, like through their agents like this, they do control all facets of life. Another fast food one that we covered was Tom Monahan, founded Domino's Pizza. He's Opus Dei, Knight of Malta. Like he's a current billionaire. He set up like a Catholic trust fund called Legatus, which is like a super elitist Catholic Wall Street trust fund, which has like a requirement where you have to be at least making $4 million a year and be Catholic to join Legatus. Monahan, the Domino's founder, was also like one of Donald Trump's economic advisors. If people aren't aware, I have this Newsmax story. I'll link this in the description. If people didn't see this, in 2016, Donald Trump nominated 34 Catholics to be advisors in his administration. I don't know if you saw that, George, but Monahan, the founder of Domino's Pizza, was among one of the 34 Catholics to be one of Trump's to be Trump advisors. I'll link that in the description here. But yeah, like just quickly, it says the headline was Donald Trump's campaign Thursday announced a list of 34 prominent conservative Catholic advisors. 34 Catholic advisors. And that should tell some people something about who's in control. And like Boris Epstein, George. You heard that name? He was a supposed Zionist Jew who was controlling Trump. He's one of Trump's economic advisors. He's a political strategist. He was a senior advisor to Trump's campaign. He was a Jew, but Boris Epstein went to the Jesuit Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And he also went to Jesuit Georgetown Law School. But Boris Epstein is a good example of a court Jew educated by the Jesuits who's, I've seen him used in a lot of propaganda videos about the Zionists controlling Trump, but they don't mention that Boris Epstein went to Georgetown.
Okay, just like they don't mention Ruth Bader Ginsburg, late husband Martin Ginsburg was a professor at Georgetown, or Janet Yellen's. They don't mention that Janet Yellen, the head of the Federal Reserve, or the chairwoman of the Federal Reserve, her husband is also a professor at Georgetown.
Absolutely, and going like a bigger, just a lot of the Jewish disinfo goes into how the Federal Reserve is like a Jewish-controlled bank, and they don't bring up how the Chief Justice of the United States, when the Federal Reserve Act was signed, Edward Douglas White, was educated at Georgetown University, Jesuit, where he was a member of the Philademic Society, and Jesuit High School. That being Chief Justice Edward Douglas White, who signed off on the Federal Reserve Act. And, Woodrow Wilson, at the time of the Federal Reserve Act was signed, had a Jesuit-trained Patrick Tumulty as his, quote, personal advisor. But, that information is completely omitted when you're dealing with the Federal Reserve. They just, they blame it on the Jews.
Well, also with Tumulty, Joseph Tumulty.
Or Joseph Patrick Tumulty?
Yes, Joe Tumulty was Wilson's advisor, and he also had a big hand in Wilson's decision in declaring war against Germany in World War I. So, and of course, I'm sure.
Well, I bet Tumulty, just quickly, I bet he was a part of it. Like the Ferdinand Folk, I put this on my blog. I put a link to the source. He actually, in 1921, like the head Allied commander during the First World War, he went to Georgetown University in 1921 and was presented like a sword of Ignatius Loyola in 1921 at Georgetown. And Folk was educated by the Jesuits over in France and had a Jesuit priest as his brother. I saw that it was probably guys like Tumulty, who were pulling the strings for that to happen, for like the grand ceremony to take place at Georgetown with Ferdinand Folk. But, now that I mentioned that, I'll link that in the description now that I bring it up. Yeah, that's a huge that huge proof that the Jesuits were controlling World War I. Like Ferdinand Folk actually says in the article that the Jesuits made his career, from his own words, Marshal Ferdinand Folk said the Jesuits made his career a success.
Well,
So that should tell people something, I think.
Well, just as they made Paul McGuinness's career a success, the manager for YouTube, Sir George Martin, the producer for the Beatles, Bradley Cooper, the actor,
Denzel Washington.
And it's just like, if you're trained by them, you're almost guaranteed a success. If you're an actor, if you're auditioning for a role,
Tom Holland, like the new Spider-Man actor. I know he's gotten a bunch of other roles, but he's a prominent child actor. Well, I guess he'd be a teenager. I think he's probably 18 or 19. Well, Tom Holland went to 2 Jesuit schools, and he was now turned into a megastar.
Yes,
as a child actor.
And of course, if you want to be a dictator, it also helps being trained by them or being advised by them. And
absolutely, Paul Biya of Cameroon, the current longest reigning ruler in the world. That's not a royal. He's been a dictator of Cameroon for 40 years. 40 years. I think just crazy. But he's been trained by the Jesuits at the Lycée Le Grand College in Paris. Robert Mugabe, who ran Zimbabwe into the ground with the crazy hyperinflation situation that was going on there, and the police state. Mugabe was trained by the Jesuits in Zimbabwe, and openly bragged about his Jesuit education.
Of course, you had Pol Pot, the leader of Cambodia in the 1970s. He went to a Catholic school. I'm not sure if it was Jesuit, but he went to a school in Phnom Penh. I guess that would have been in the 1930s or 40s. So you have all these thugs.
Oh, another great information with Pol Pot. Ngo Diem in Vietnam was a thug at that time. He created his police state, murdered thousands in South Vietnam. He literally turned Vietnam into a Catholic utopia. He tried to model society off Pope Pius IX's syllabus of errors.
So, something I've mentioned on shows before, generally speaking, your thugs are Catholic or Catholic trained. I mean, if you just talk about Pol Pot, people, when you're talking about the dictators of history, a few names come up, Mao Zedong, Stalin, Hitler, but one of the names that slips through the crack, relatively speaking, is Pol Pot, because in terms of, he may not have put up the numbers as those other figures, but relatively speaking, he was just as vicious, because when in 1970, Cambodia had a population of something like 7 million people. And the Khmer Rouge took over 1975, and they killed somewhere between 1 and 3 million of that 7 million. So it's hard to, so at minimum 14%, but in upwards of 40% of the population. So as I said, relatively speaking, he was just as vicious as Hitler or Stalin.
No, absolutely. Yeah, the Khmer Rouge, it was ruthless. And just mentioning, you were talking about Catholic thugs. I grabbed here my copy of this by April 1945 issue of the Converted Catholic magazine. But they talk about Tom Pendergrast and the quote Big Tom Pendergrast of Kansas City, the political mob boss who was ruling the city. He was good friends with Truman. Interesting. Yeah. Pendergrast was a Knight of Columbus, but it says here that I'm just going to quote. It's interesting here. It says examples are plentiful of such big-time Catholic criminals and racketeers continuing in crime without any qualms of conscience. Quote, Big Tom Pendergrast of Kansas City, who died recently, this is 1945, after release from federal penitentiary, was one of them. Under his rule, Kansas City was a menace to the morals of the young and old. Brothels flourished openly and criminal gangs enforced his dictates. Gambling houses were as commonplace as grocery stores, and he himself was the biggest gambler of his age. Political corruption abounded in Pendergrass, as boss of it all, grew fabulously rich from the wealth that flowed into his pockets from the underground traffic and crime. Yet, when he died last January 26th, Monsignor Thomas B. McDonald, who preached his funeral sermon after solemn high mass, publicly proclaimed him, quote, a man with a noble heart and a true friend, because, quote, he went to mass every morning at 7:30 for 30 years, end quote. And that's interesting. The Catholic priest was saying that Tom Pendergrass, like the mob boss, was going to mass for 30 years at 7:30 in the morning. But I'm just going to read a little bit more here. It's just from the article. It says, Tom Pendergrass and other Catholic criminals like him do not fear the penalties of the civil law because he could escape them by bribing and corrupting judges and officers of law who he himself had appointed. As a Catholic, however, he feared the tortures of hell in the next life, but he was assured by his church's teaching that he could also escape God's punishment as long as he went to the confession regularly, told his crimes to the priest, and said he was sorry merely because he was afraid of going to hell. Yeah, I'll wrap it there, but it goes into a bit of also like Mayor Haig in Jersey City was another devout Catholic mayor as well. But Pendergrass, people aren't aware. It's interesting also just how close Harry Truman was with Tom Pendergrass.
Well, Harry Truman had a couple of silver cats. One was Dirty Harry, and you could say he was the original one. And the other one was not as charitable, Whorehouse Harry, because he ran houses of ill repute. And so that was how he got his launch into politics. But there have been other figures. You're talking about Tom Pendergrass. More recently, about a decade or so ago, Ted Kennedy died and had a big funeral mass. Thousands of people were in attendance. It was officiated by the Archbishop of Boston, Mass, Sean Cardinal O'Malley. And O'Malley, said, "Oh, Ted is, gone home to be with the Lord, and is a faithful son of the church," and all that sort of stuff. And when other mob boss, well, technically speaking, Ted wasn't a mob boss, but other figures like Luciano and Al Capone, they had big masses when they died. And generally speaking, almost all your major crime figures in the U.S. have been Catholics. Yes, there have been a few token Jews like Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky, but generally speaking, they're the bookkeepers. You almost all of them were Catholic.
Recently, Whitey Bulger was Catholic recently, and his a big mobster out of Boston, and his brother, and interestingly, he was an FBI informant while being a mobster. That's interesting in itself. Whitey Bulger's brother, William Bulger, was educated by the Jesuits at Boston College High School and Boston College. Whitey Bulger. I just mentioned that he's another example of a Catholic mobster, and there was a recent Hollywood movie. I haven't seen it, but there was a Jesuit theater movie done on him recently with Johnny Depp playing Whitey Bulger.
And of course, this is a conversation I've had with Johnny. Is regardless of what your position is on abortion or contraception, it is officially it goes against abortion, contraception go against Catholic teaching. And how many Catholic politicians and judges have there been on either side of the border?
Well, think when the time that there was an actually like Jesuit priest in the U.S. House of Representatives, Robert Drinan, S.J., like he was a pro-abortion, candidate.
Okay, and
it's interesting.
But generally speaking, you have high abortion rates in historically Catholic countries: France, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Luxembourg, all throughout Latin America, places like Mexico. And but just talking about America, I mean, how many politicians and judges are there or have there been who openly, officially flout the church's teachings on those issues? Nancy Pelosi, the aforementioned Ted Kennedy, Joe Biden, Jerry Brown, fill in the blank. The list is almost endless. But they're considered to be good Catholics and good standing in the church. They can go to mass, every week. And when they do die, look at masses with thousands of people showing up. And not only that, but they baptize their children and grandchildren, and they have weddings that look almost like royal events. And so you say, I'm just wondering. I thought the Catholic Church was against things like abortion, but the politicians, the senators and representatives and governors, subjects. Well, speaking of getting memos, I know that's an antiquated term. I need to. I just got a text, and so I need to call it an evening.
Oh, sounds good. Good talk tonight, George. I'll be in touch, and yeah, we'll broadcast again. Sometime this week or next week.
Okay, and I just want to. This is a teaser for next time. Something I like to do is to talk about foundations and think tanks. How, generally speaking, those are conduits for Roman control. Whether you're talking, this is just a teaser. So I'm not, whether you're talking, we're talking earlier about the Hegelian dialectic with the Federalist Society or the American Constitution Society. Whether you're talking about supposedly conservative groups or you're talking supposedly liberal groups, Rome runs it all.
No, absolutely. It's undeniable once you look into it. We've been putting the evidence out there, but it is undeniable when you start looking into who's controlling things. But yeah, we'll call it there. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Take care.
Oh, okay. Well, take care. So.